We'll start out with a straight seam, and anytime you're sewing, you're always positioning your fabrics with right sides together, like I'm doing now. And then the easiest way to hold those fabrics together is to pin them, and it's a good idea to pin perpendicular to the edge, and this also makes it easy to take the pins out as you're sewing. And I pin every, I don't know, 6 inches or so, not that often. You can pin more frequently than that if you're feeling uncomfortable or if you just want a little extra help with your seam. But really, that's all that's required. We've got our right sides together and we've got our pins in the fabric to hold it. When you start sewing curves, there are 2 different kinds of curves. There are matching curves, like these, which when we place the fabric with right sides together, the curves really do match each other. These are relatively easy to pin because, just like with the straight seam, we just have to hold those 2 pieces of fabric together every so often. And again, with pins perpendicular. That's very straightforward. The other kind of curve is contrasting curves or opposing curves. For example, the top of this skirt with the bottom edge of the yoke. You can see when I start pinning these together, they don't match at all. They really are opposing. And the easiest way to handle a situation like this is, first of all, it's really helpful to have some notches or something that will sort of guide you what matches which part along the curve. I'm going to start out with the outside edges. And then I'll work my way, I think I'll pin something towards the middle, and then I'll sort of work my way in. So I've pinned the outside edges. Now I'm going to pin the center so that they match. And then I have a notch that matches the seam. This will be helpful for just making sure everything aligns. And another one on the opposite side. And now things are starting to come together. One thing that will help is anytime you have a shorter curve, the inside curve, I like to take a few just little clips in there, and that will release the seam allowance, which we'll explain more about later, and allow the cut edge of the fabric to match up with the cut edge of the opposite fabric. And this can take a little fiddling. We'll put a couple of pins in, and then I'll go back and adjust this pin. Put another one in over here just to hold everything in place. And this can look a little funny when it's all pinned in position. It doesn't look like it should make any sense when you stitch it, but you'll see once we've actually sewn it that it goes together really nicely and makes a really pretty curved seam when it's finished. Coming around to the back here, just put a few more clips in here. And then again, we can kind of stretch the shorter curve to match the longer one. And we're just really looking to get those 2 edges lined up as well as we can, while keeping the portion that will be stitched, which is about a ½ inch in. We'll still keep that straight. So you can see it looks a little funny right now because the yoke is matching the curve of the skirt, so it's sort of puckering here. But when we flip it up, this is what it's going to look like when we sew it. It's going to make a nice curve there. When you sit down at the machine to start sewing, there are a few things to keep in mind. One is, it's always a good idea to remove your pins before you sew over them. If you forget and sew over a pin, it's probably not the end of the world, but it's a lot safer if you remove them before you sew over them. I'm lifting the presser foot. There's a little lever on the back of the machine that lifts up that presser foot, and you just put the fabric right underneath the presser foot. And then it's always a good idea to start out sewing with a couple of back stitches, which is literally sewing backwards before you start sewing forwards, and that knots your thread essentially and prevents it from pulling out later on. So I'm going to start just a couple of stitches in from the back edge of my fabric, and I have a little button on my machine here that I push, and that allows me to stitch backwards. Just a couple of stitches. You don't have to go far, just enough to hold everything in place. And then I can start stitching forward. And you'll see as I'm sewing, I'm going to hold my fabric usually in two places. I like to hold off to the side and I hold in front. And the reason for that is it allows me to sort of guide my fabric and stitch exactly where I want to stitch. And when I teach people to sew, I often use the analogy of driving a car, where when you're driving, you're not looking at the front of the car to see where you're going. You're looking somewhere down the road. It's the same thing with sewing. Rather than looking at your needle and trying to line up your fabric at your needle, you actually look ahead of the presser foot itself. And you can see on the sewing machine itself, there are some lines here that show you how big the seam allowance, in other words, the space between your stitching and the edge of the fabric, how wide that seam allowance is as you're stitching. I'm using today a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is right in between the 3/8 inch marking and the 5/8 inch marking. You'll see there's another line in there that's not indicated. It doesn't have a measurement on it, in other words, but it's the 4/8 or 1/2 inch marking. So I'm going to line up the cut edge of the fabric with that line as I'm sewing. And the reason that line is up ahead of the needle is because, like with driving, if you get the edge of your fabric lined up with that mark, it gives you plenty of chance to keep an even seam allowance before you get to this actual stitching at your needle. And so I'll continue to guide the fabric right along that marking, just holding it in position, gently guiding it. You don't have to do much. There are feed dogs underneath the foot. They're those little grooved things. They move backwards every time you take a step, and they're actually guiding your fabric through the machine. So all you do is show it where you want it to stitch, and it does the rest of the work. Now, as I get down to the corner, another thing you can do, if you're stitching a corner itself, if you want to do a corner, with your hand you can turn the crank wheel to bring the needle right down into your fabric. And this machine actually has a needle up, needle down function that I can use as well, but a lot of machines don't have that, in which case you just use this crank wheel. Always turn it towards you, and with the needle down in the fabric, I can raise the lever to lift the presser foot and then reposition the fabric itself before I lower the presser foot and continue sewing. So this allows you to do a corner, or if you start getting off a bit, you can just adjust your way. It's also really useful when you get to sewing curves. And again, I'm just holding that fabric, just guiding it along until I get to the end. And then once again, I'll just take a couple of back stitches just to knot my thread. And then I have a special little thread cutting mechanism on here that makes everything nice and easy. Otherwise, you just pull your threads and snip them. And we've got a seam sewn. If we open it up, we can see that we've sewn the two pieces of fabric together. Here's the wrong side of our seam with the seam allowances showing. Now, one thing I want to point out to you is I use two different colors of thread. I use the turquoise in my spool at the top, and I use more of a burgundy color in the bobbin. And one of the reasons I did that is so that you can also see what's called tension in a sewing machine. When those two threads are traveling parallel to each other and they're twisting around each other, ideally, you want that twist to happen right in between the two layers of fabric. And if you look really closely, sometimes you can see, especially if I use two different colors of thread, you can see if I pull those fabrics apart, you can actually see where the two threads are twisting. And if they're twisting right in between the two layers of fabric, then you know your tension is balanced really nicely. Now, if the tension is off a bit, you should only ever adjust the tension on your top spool of thread. There is a tension adjustment in the bobbin. It's really, really touchy. It's really difficult to adjust. I recommend that you send that one to your sewing machine repair person if you need to do any adjustment there. Any adjustment that you do at home should only be done with a tension adjustment dial that's found on your machine. It will be found here. Sometimes it's an adjustment down here, but you can make it tighter by dialing it higher and looser by dialing it lower. And you'll see pretty quickly and pretty easily how to adjust that. But it's really easy to see that that adjustment needs to be made if you do two different colors of thread. Sewing the curved seam will be the same as sewing the straight seam. We'll just line it up, back stitch a couple of stitches, and then continue on our way. And again, I'm just lining it up with that edge keeping it equidistant from the seam allowance guide long before it gets to my needle, so I don't even have to worry about it. And I'm just taking out the pins before I get to them. Some machines also have what's called a lock stitch, which is this little target-shaped button up here. It's kind of like a back stitch, but it just stitches in one place for a few stitches, and that's kind of a nice one to use as well. And then we cut our thread, and there you've got a curved seam. Now, I also want to show you the opposing curved seam that we had pinned, because this can be a little bit trickier to sew. You're going to want to do this one in short sections, just to be sure that everything is matching up okay. I like to sew it with the trickier part usually on the top. Because we're sort of contouring to the shape of the skirt, which is the underneath fabric, I'm going to keep the yoke fabric on the top because I can really see what's going on then, and I can make sure that nothing is puckering or getting in the way or doing anything wrong. So I'm going to start out near a side seam here, take a couple of back stitches. I should also mention that when you're doing a straight stitch, generally for most purposes you want your stitch length to be between 2.5 and 3.5 millimeters. I'm stitching nice and slowly here, taking the pins out as I go along, and just making sure that all the fabric lies smoothly. So by keeping your stitch length to between 2.5 and 3.5, that will be a good length for most projects. Different sewing machine feet require different stitch lengths. I don't know if you just noticed, I just put my needle down in the machine so that I could lift up the foot and just adjust things a little bit. I'm just going to continue going along nice and slowly, making sure everything's nice and flat, laying smoothly. I can feel underneath here that the bottom layer is not laying completely smoothly, which is why I'm stopping and occasionally adjusting. And then we get to an easier stretch. And there we go. Then I'll back stitch a couple on the other end of it. Cut the threads, and now you can see when I lay it out that we have a nice curved seam here. So let's say that you finish your seam and you look at it and you have some puckers, or you realize that you made a mistake and you stitched the wrong thing to the wrong thing. What do? There's this fabulous tool called the seam ripper, and it's got a little blade that's right in the hook of it right there. And in order to use it, you simply slip the longest part of it underneath your stitch and you push, and that little blade will cut the stitch. And you don't have any danger of actually cutting your fabric this way. You're simply cutting the thread itself. So I usually, when I have to rip out a section, I cut every, 4 or 5 stitches, something like that. But I just work my way along the segment that I want to fix, and I cut each of those threads, and then if you just give a little tug, it will come apart there, and you can restitch that part. So now I can just go in and fix that little mistake, or you can do the whole thing that way if you've sewn the wrong sides of the fabric together or something like that. But a seam ripper is probably your most crucial tool when you're a beginning sewist especially.